Great, thanks for coming. I'm presenting today on behalf of my co-authors, Ariel Weingarten and Edward Lank at the School of Computer Science, and we're all at the University of Waterloo. So this work was motivated by two trends, recent trends in technology. The first is the availability and ubiquity of large displays, and especially now we're seeing them placed in very public places for very public tasks. And these tasks are very often short-lived as well. So you can imagine visiting one of these large displays in a shopping mall or in a business center and using them to look at directions, maybe a mall of a shopping mall, or maybe looking at the location of one of your colleagues' offices. And so they're being used for these very short-lived tasks, but we don't necessarily know entirely how to be designing the interfaces to support those types of tasks. The second trend that motivated this work is proxemics and the use of body trackers to understand where people are related to these displays and to design for those types of interactions. And in particular, work by Vogel and Balakrishnan that was published quite some time ago at WIST that looked at defining some of these interaction zones in front of these large displays. So they defined zones ranging from ambient to subtle to personal, and explored how the interface might react to users approaching the displays and presenting information to them in different ways depending on where they are. So based on these two bodies of work, we wanted to investigate how we might be able to support those very short-lived search tasks on these public displays. So our research question was, how do individuals define personal space on these public displays for visual search tasks? And throughout the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you that users tended to fall into two groups, matching the personal and subtle interaction zones, and also provide maybe a practical rule of thumb for how to define workspaces on these public displays. So to explore the research question, we performed a lab study on our own very large interactive display. It's about a 170-inch diagonal display consisting of 8 HD displays aligned in a 4x2 grid. And to define a personal workspace on this display, users would just approach it and drag their finger across the display in a diagonal. And essentially, once they lifted their finger from the display, the workspace would be defined. And to explore how the visual search would actually take place on the display, we had participants perform a Where's Waldo search task. So we recruited 21 students from the University of Waterloo, 4 of them were female. They were asked to approach the display, define a workspace, and when they lifted their finger from the display, a Where's Waldo puzzle would appear. For those of you who aren't familiar with Where's Waldo, he's a children's book character. He's usually hidden in a very busy image in one of these pictures. You can see a thumbnail there. You'll see more in the rest of the talk. And the participants were just asked to very quickly find Waldo and a few other items in the image and verbally identify them to the investigator. And throughout that task, we measured things like how big the workspace was and all of their interactions with the workspace throughout the task. And in total, the task lasted about 5 minutes, and people were given a candy bar for their time. The other factor we included in the study was aspect ratio. So we wanted to get a feel for how different types of content on the display might end up being sized. And it was very difficult to think of all the different types of content that people might work with. So as a bit of a proxy for that, we decided to incorporate portrait, square, and landscape images. And part of the reason that's important is because if you have a very long and wide display like ours, a portrait image actually maximizes to a very, very much smaller size than a landscape image. And so this gave us a bit of a sense of how people might use those different types of content on the large display. Okay, so we ran the study, and what did we learn? Well, first of all, in terms of the quantitative results, we really found no differences in terms of the initial height or width or the aspect ratio of the images of the workspaces. And in general, participants tended to create a fairly small workspace initially, and then make it a little bit bigger as time went on and they figured out what they wanted to do with the space. If you're interested in all of those measurements that we collected throughout the study, they're all provided in the paper, and I'd encourage you to take a look there later on. I'm not going to present them today. When we take a look at aspect ratio, our results suggest that aspect ratio actually played a fairly small role in terms of their workspace requirements. They tended to define the same type of workspace regardless of which one of those aspect ratios they were working in. But we did take a little bit more of a qualitative look at how they interacted with the display, and it looks like where the user was standing might be useful in terms of determining their workspace requirements. So participants generally fell into one of two search strategies. The first group we'll call minimizers. They defined a fairly small workspace measuring about 60 centimeters square stood very close to the display and actually used a bit of a pan and scan technique where they used the touch interface to move the image around within that workspace to do the search task. The second group we'll call maximizers. They defined a much larger workspace, took a big step back from the display. The workspace was about twice the size of the other group, 100 by 80 centimeters, and performed what you'd call a more traditional visual search task. So it was completely hands-off, only using their eyes. So if you're interested in that original research question that we provided at the beginning of the talk, how can you use this to design interfaces for these public visual search tasks? Well, the key takeaways here are that the aspect ratio appears to play a small role in determining the visual workspace requirements. We found that participants were generally divided fairly evenly between those two groups of minimizers and maximizers, and that depending on where they were standing, they had those very different requirements. And so a very simple rule of thumb that may be helpful is that the subtle interaction requires about twice the screen real estate of personal interaction. Great, so that concludes my talk. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks.
Surely someone has some thoughts on this work.
Hi, Jim.
Hi.
They only did these as individuals, or were
Yeah.
they ever doing them together? So what's going to happen when, obviously it's a big display and it's public, so lots of people can kind of come up and do this at once. What do you think is going to happen?
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking. I get to talk about my paper last year. So we ran a similar study last year where we had people actually come up and use the display collaboratively, and we measured interpersonal distances throughout those tasks. And we actually provide kind of a similar type of rule of thumb conclusion there, where people tend to space out as much as possible. And so we don't think that there's going to be too much of a problem there in terms of people are kind of maximizing the space to something that's pretty reasonable for where they're going to be standing relative to each other.
Cool. Thank you.
Do you think that men and women might perform the task differently?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Yeah, I'm sure you can look at all sorts of different groups. I think children as well would be really interesting. People have very well-established different cultural boundaries in terms of interpersonal space. And so that is a limitation of what we've done here, but I think it's been explored elsewhere, and it absolutely could be considered here too.
Mary Sherwinski, of course, has her paper entitled Women Take a Wider View.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else? Thank you, James Wallace.
Thank you.